You are not lost. You are over-adapted. And that might be worse. Because when you are lost, you search. But when you are adapted to something false, you call it normal. And that is where the danger begins. Jung warned about this. He saw it before social media, before digital dopamine, before identity became performance. He saw a generation slowly disconnecting from the self, not because they were evil, not because they were weak, but because they were trying to survive. And survival can look like success. You learned early. Fit in. Be useful. Be impressive. Be agreeable. Be productive. Do not be too much. Do not be strange. Do not be intense. Do not be different. So you built a persona, a polished one, capable, witty, aware, functional, and the world rewarded it. But something inside you went quiet. Jung called this the split, when the outer personality grows stronger, while the inner core grows unheard. At first, you don't notice it. You're busy. You're achieving. You're adapting. But then something strange happens. You wake up tired. Not physically, existentially. You scroll, but nothing satisfies. You achieve, but nothing anchors. You connect, but nothing feels intimate. This is not laziness. It is not weakness. It is not a lack of gratitude. It is psychic misalignment. Jung believed every human being carries within them a blueprint, not a career path, not a social role, a psychological destiny. He called it individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are, not who you were trained to be, not who gets applause, not who avoids rejection, who you are beneath adaptation. But here is the warning. If you ignore this process long enough, the psyche does not stay silent. It revolts through anxiety, through depression, through sudden collapse, through meaninglessness that feels unbearable, because the self will not be replaced by performance forever. And this generation, you, were handed a world that rewards persona more than essence, branding over being, image over integration, visibility over depth. You are told to curate yourself, market yourself, optimize yourself, but rarely to know yourself. And that is the fracture. Jung warned that when a culture becomes too externalized, the individual becomes internally hollow. And hollow people are easy to manipulate, easy to distract, easy to exhaust, because they do not know what they are anchored to. So they chase status, validation, productivity, relationships, trends. But the chasing never ends, because what they are actually seeking is internal coherence. And that cannot be downloaded. It must be discovered. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Many people who feel lost are not searching. They are avoiding. Avoiding silence. Avoiding depth. Avoiding the confrontation with who they might actually be, without the mask. Because to meet the self is destabilizing. It may require leaving spaces where you are praised. It may require disappointing people who prefer your compliance. It may require admitting you built a life that doesn't fully fit, and that is terrifying. So instead, you numb, you optimize, you distract, you tell yourself, I just need more clarity. But clarity does not come from thinking harder. It comes from listening deeper. Jung believed the unconscious speaks constantly, through dreams, through recurring patterns, through the kind of people you are drawn to, through the kind of problems that repeat in your life. These are not random. They are signals. But modern life is loud, and the unconscious is subtle. So you miss it. You override it. You silence it with logic. And then you wonder why your life feels slightly off. This generation is not stupid. It is overstimulated, not incapable, just disconnected from inner authority. Jung warned that when individuals lose connection to their inner center, they seek belonging in collective identities, tribes, ideologies, movements, anything that replaces the feeling of inner grounding, because it is easier to adopt a belief than to discover your own, easier to repeat a narrative than to sit in uncertainty. But borrowed identity does not satisfy the psyche. It only delays the confrontation, and that confrontation always comes. usually in crisis. A breakup, a burnout, a failure, a quiet moment where you realize, I don't know who I am without this. That moment is not collapse. It is initiation, but only if you face it. Jung's warning was not dramatic. It was precise. If you do not make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. So many people say, this is just how life is. This is just adulthood. This is just reality. But sometimes reality is just long-term self-betrayal normalized. The lost generation is not lost geographically. It is lost internally. And the solution is not louder ambition. It is deeper alignment. But alignment requires honesty. And honesty requires courage. Because you might discover you don't want what you've been chasing. You don't believe what you've been defending. You don't love in the way you've been performing. And that realization can dismantle everything, which is why most people avoid it. But here is Jung's deeper warning. If you do not choose transformation voluntarily, the psyche will force it involuntarily. Through breakdown, through chaos, through symptoms that refuse to be ignored. The self does not disappear. It waits. It signals. It intensifies. Until you listen. The question is not whether you feel lost. The question is whether you are willing to be found by something deeper than your persona. Because the path back is not glamorous. It involves shadow work, meeting the parts of you rejected, to be accepted, anger, sensitivity, ambition, creativity, desire, instinct, grief. You cannot become whole by editing yourself into likability. Wholeness includes contradiction, and this generation fears contradiction. It wants clarity, certainty, fixed identity. But the psyche is fluid, alive, dynamic. To individuate is to tolerate internal tension without collapsing into performance. That is maturity, not aesthetic success. Psychological integration. And Jung believed this work is not optional. If you want meaning, meaning does not come from applause. It comes from alignment between your inner and outer life. So if you feel lost, good. It means the persona is cracking. It means the old adaptation is no longer sufficient. It means the self is pressing forward. Do not rush to patch the crack. Sit in it. Listen. Ask, what part of me have I ignored? What truth have I postponed? What desire have I minimized? What fear has been running my decisions? You are not lost. You are at the edge of individuation, and that edge feels unstable because the old identity is dissolving before the new one is embodied. That space in between is what Jung would call the necessary disorientation of growth. The warning is not that you are doomed. The warning is that comfort can become your prison, distraction can become your anesthetic, and approval can become your cage. The generation that feels lost is actually the generation closest to awakening, but only if it chooses depth over distraction, silence over noise, integration over performance. The world does not need more optimized personas. It needs individuals who know themselves, and that work, that is yours. The most dangerous thing about feeling lost is not confusion. It's imitation. When you don't know who you are, you copy what looks certain. You copy confidence. You copy ambition. You copy opinions. You copy lifestyles. And slowly, you disappear. Jung understood this long before algorithms. He watched how easily the individual dissolves into the collective, not because they are weak, but because belonging feels safer than becoming. Becoming requires separation, and separation feels like death to the ego. So instead of individuating, you adapt to trends, to friend groups, to political tribes, to productivity culture, to whatever gives you immediate identity. And it works. Temporarily, you feel defined, you feel positioned, you feel less alone. But underneath that adopted structure, something restless grows. Because imitation never satisfies the psyche. The psyche wants expression, original expression, not borrowed conviction, not aesthetic alignment, not moral performance. It wants embodiment. And when it doesn't get it, it creates symptoms. Anxiety that feels irrational, sadness that feels unexplained, anger that feels disproportionate. You think something is wrong with you. But what if nothing is wrong? What if something inside you is refusing to live secondhand? Jung believed that much of modern neurosis comes from unlived lives. Think about that. Unlived lives. The artist who chose safety, the thinker who chose conformity, the sensitive soul who chose emotional numbness, the ambitious spirit who chose invisibility to avoid rejection. All of that energy does not disappear. It goes underground, into the shadow, and the shadow does not stay quiet. It leaks through envy, through criticism, through projection. You see someone living boldly, and you call them arrogant. You see someone resting, and you call them lazy. You see someone expressing emotion, and you call them dramatic. But often, what irritates you is what you abandoned in yourself. This is the shadow at work, and this generation is flooded with shadow projection, online, offline, constant judgment, constant comparison, constant moral signaling. Why? Because people are disconnected from their own center. And when you are disconnected, you regulate yourself through others, through likes, through agreement, through external mirrors. But Jung warned, the more you depend on the collective for identity, the weaker your inner authority becomes. And when inner authority weakens, you feel lost, not because the world is unclear, but because you no longer trust your own compass. So you ask everyone else what to do. What career is stable? What relationship is acceptable? What belief is safe? What lifestyle is admired? And the answers are endless, conflicting, overwhelming. No wonder you feel paralyzed. You were never meant to crowdsource your soul. Individuation is solitary work. Not lonely, but solitary. There will be seasons where you feel misunderstood, seasons where your growth makes others uncomfortable, seasons where you question everything you once defended. That is not instability. That is restructuring. But here is where Jung's warning sharpens. If you refuse this restructuring, you become rigid. And rigidity feels like certainty, but it is fear disguised as clarity. You cling to identities. You defend positions aggressively. You attack anything that threatens your framework. Because if the framework collapses, you don't know who you are. So you fight, not for truth, for psychological survival. Look around. How much outrage is actually fear? How much certainty is actually insecurity? How much noise is actually avoidance of silence? A generation that feels lost often becomes loud because silence would force reflection, and reflection would force confrontation with the unlived life, with the shadow, with the compromises. But Jung did not see confrontation as destruction. He saw it as initiation. The psyche is not trying to punish you. It is trying to complete you. That anxiety you feel might be misdirected instinct. That emptiness might be unused depth. That restlessness might be creativity denied expression. But if you label everything as disorder, you miss the invitation. Jung warned against over-pathologizing the soul. Not every crisis is illness. Some crises are transformation trying to happen. But transformation is inconvenient. It disrupts comfort. It challenges relationships. It exposes illusions. And illusions are seductive, especially the illusion that you are fine, because you are functioning. Functioning is not the same as fulfilled. You can be efficient and spiritually starving. You can be admired and internally fragmented. You can be socially connected and psychologically alone. The lost generation is high functioning, highly aware, highly informed, highly stimulated, but rarely still. Stillness is where the self speaks, and stillness feels unbearable when you are disconnected, because in stillness, there is no distraction from the inner void. So you stay busy, even with self-improvement. Even growth can become avoidance. You optimize routines. You consume content about healing. You talk about trauma. You analyze attachment styles. But do you sit quietly and feel your own contradictions? Do you admit your jealousy, your hidden ambition, your suppressed anger? Your hunger for significance? Integration is not aesthetic. It is messy. You will discover parts of yourself that contradict your public identity, and that can feel humiliating. But Jung insisted, what you do not integrate will control you. The generation that feels lost is often terrified of being seen as flawed, so it performs morality, performs empathy, performs enlightenment. But performance fractures the psyche. Because the shadow grows in secrecy, the more perfect the persona, the darker the unconscious becomes. And when it finally erupts, it shocks everyone, including you. That is why Jung emphasized wholeness over goodness. Wholeness includes darkness, includes selfish impulses, includes destructive fantasies, includes raw instinct. Not to act them out blindly, but to acknowledge them consciously. A person who knows their darkness is less dangerous than a person who denies it. And this generation, raised to curate everything, has become skilled at hiding shadow. But hiding is not healing. It is postponement. So here is the deeper layer of the warning. If you feel lost, ask yourself, where have I edited myself to remain acceptable? Where have I muted my voice to maintain belonging? Where have I betrayed instinct for approval? Those betrayals accumulate. And over time, you look around and think, how did I end up here? Not because you were careless, but because you were compliant. Compliance feels safe, but it erodes identity slowly. And slow erosion is harder to detect than sudden collapse. The collapse at least forces clarity. The slow erosion feels normal until one day you wake up and your life feels foreign. Jung did not promise comfort. He promised meaning, and meaning is earned through integration, through honest confrontation, through reclaiming the parts of you you abandoned to survive. This is not rebellion for the sake of rebellion. It is alignment, and alignment is quiet. It does not scream online. It does not demand validation. It stabilizes you internally. So when trends shift, you don't fracture. When opinions clash, you don't dissolve. When rejection comes, you don't collapse. Because you are anchored. The generation that feels lost is not weak. It is unanchored. And anchoring begins when you stop asking, who should I be? And start asking, what in me refuses to die? That question is where individuation begins. There is a reason you feel divided, a reason you feel like there are multiple versions of you. One for work, one for family, one for friends, one online, one alone at night. That division is not random. It is constructed carefully over years. Jung called this split the tension between the persona and the shadow. The persona is what you present. The shadow is what you suppress. And the more polished the persona becomes, the more powerful the shadow grows. This generation has perfected persona. You curate opinions. You curate aesthetics. You curate vulnerability. Even authenticity is branded now. But the psyche cannot be branded. It wants truth, raw truth, and truth is rarely neat. So what happens when an entire generation learns to present before it learns to integrate? It becomes fragile, not weak. Fragile, because a fragile identity requires constant reinforcement, constant feedback, constant reassurance. You don't feel stable, you feel maintained. And maintenance is exhausting. Jung warned that when the persona dominates, the individual becomes estranged from instinct. Instinct is messy. It doesn't ask if it's appropriate. It doesn't check engagement metrics. It moves from something deeper. And when instinct is suppressed long enough, life feels mechanical, predictable, colorless. You start confusing safety with stagnation, and stagnation with maturity. But stagnation is not peace. It is trapped energy. The shadow holds that energy. Your anger, your competitiveness, your sexuality, your creativity, your hunger for power, your desire to be extraordinary. Yes, even that. Many people suppress their desire to be significant because they fear being judged as arrogant. So they shrink. They call it humility. But inside, resentment builds. Resentment toward those who dare to shine. Resentment toward those who take space. Resentment toward those who live boldly. Jung would say, what you resent reveals what you disowned. The shadow is not just darkness. It is unlived potential, unexpressed vitality, unclaimed strength. This generation talks about healing constantly, but healing without shadow integration becomes self-soothing. True integration destabilizes you first, because you realize you are not as innocent as you thought, not as purely rational, not as purely moral. You are contradictory, capable of kindness and cruelty, depth and pettiness, love and envy. And that realization can feel like a collapse, but it is actually expansion. The problem is, modern culture encourages projection over reflection. Instead of asking, why does this trigger me? You ask, why are they like this? Instead of examining your own aggression, you condemn someone else's. Instead of confronting your own ambition, you criticize capitalism. Instead of facing your own insecurity, you attack confidence. Projection is easier. Reflection is lonely. But without reflection, the shadow remains unconscious. An unconscious shadow is dangerous, individually and collectively. Jung warned that societies that refuse to confront their collective shadow become destructive. History proves this, but it also happens personally. When you deny your capacity for darkness, you become blind to it. And blind darkness is impulsive, reactive, explosive. That's why people shock themselves. I don't know why I said that. I don't know why I reacted like that. You don't know, because you never met that part of you consciously. The lost generation often prides itself on awareness. But awareness of social issues is not the same as awareness of the self. You can analyze the world endlessly and still avoid your own interior. And your interior is where transformation lives. So here is the uncomfortable confrontation. What part of you are you afraid to admit exists? Your jealousy? Your need for control? Your desire for validation? Your capacity for manipulation? Your fear of mediocrity? Your secret longing to be seen as superior? These thoughts do not make you evil. They make you human. But if you deny them, they act out sideways. Passive aggression, sarcasm, subtle sabotage, self-sabotage. The shadow will express itself, one way or another. Jung did not believe in eliminating darkness. He believed in integrating it. To integrate something means to know it, without being possessed by it. To feel anger, without becoming cruelty. To feel desire, without becoming addiction. To feel ambition, without becoming corruption. Integration creates strength. Suppression creates distortion. And distortion is everywhere. You see it in outrage culture, in virtue signaling, in sudden moral collapses, in idolizing people, then destroying them. Because people project their denied darkness onto public figures. They make them either pure or evil. No middle ground. But there is always middle ground. Because humans are complex. And complexity terrifies a generation trained on simplicity. Good, bad, right, wrong, cancel, approve. But the psyche does not operate in binaries. It operates in paradox. You can be wounded and responsible. You can be sensitive and strong. You can be kind and assertive. But paradox requires psychological capacity, and capacity grows through shadow work. The reason you feel lost may not be because you lack direction. It may be because you are fragmented, different parts of you, pulling in opposite directions. One part wants safety. One part wants risk. One part wants belonging. One part wants sovereignty. One part wants to be invisible. One part wants to be unforgettable. If you ignore this internal tension, you will oscillate. Start something. Quit. Commit. Doubt. Love. Withdraw. Not because you are unstable, but because you are unintegrated. Jung saw this oscillation as the call to individuation. The psyche is demanding unity, not perfection. Unity, to sit with your contradictions long enough for something deeper to organize them. That process is slow, uncomfortable, private. It cannot be performed. And that's why many avoid it, because it yields no instant validation, no applause, just gradual solidity, a quiet sense of self-trust. And self-trust is rare. This generation trusts data, reviews, algorithms, influencers. But does it trust instinct? That quiet internal knowing? Or has it outsourced that too? When you disconnect from instinct, you feel perpetually uncertain, even about small decisions, because you've silenced the internal compass. Shadow integration restores instinct, because instinct lives in the parts you rejected, the emotional, the irrational, the intense. Reclaim them consciously, and they stop controlling you unconsciously. Jung's warning was clear. What you resist persists. What you integrate transforms. The generation that feels lost is standing at a threshold. It can continue curating personas, projecting shadows, and chasing borrowed identities. Or it can descend into the uncomfortable interior, where envy is examined, where resentment is owned, where ambition is reclaimed, where fear is faced. That descent feels like disorientation, but it is actually alignment beginning. You are not breaking. You are shedding. But shedding feels like loss. Before it feels like liberation. And most people retreat. Right before the integration happens. They distract. They numb. They reattach to old identities. Because the in-between space feels too unstable. But that in-between space is the birthplace of the self. And Jung believed very few people have the courage to stay there long enough. The question is not whether you feel lost. The question is, are you willing to meet the parts of yourself that might change everything? If you are, then you are not lost. You are on the edge of becoming whole. After the collapse, after the confrontation, after the shadow has been named, there is silence, and that silence feels unfamiliar because you are no longer pretending. You are no longer performing certainty. You are no longer chasing borrowed identities. You are standing without decoration. And at first, that feels empty. But it is not emptiness. It is space. Space where something real can grow. Jung called this process individuation, not self-improvement, not reinvention. Individuation, the slow integration of everything you are. Light, dark, strength, fragility, ambition, doubt. You stop trying to eliminate parts of yourself. You start organizing them. This is where the generation that feels lost has an opportunity no other generation had. Because awareness is already there. The language is already there. The hunger for depth is already there. What's missing is courage. Courage to disconnect from the collective noise. Courage to tolerate misunderstanding. Courage to build a life that makes sense internally, even if it looks unconventional externally. Rebuilding begins with one shift. You stop asking, what will work? And you start asking, what is true? Not what is trending. Not what is safe. Not what is applauded. What is true? Truth stabilizes the psyche, even when it disrupts your environment. When you act against your truth, your body knows. Tension, anxiety, fatigue. When you act in alignment, even if it's difficult, there is energy, not excitement. Energy. Jung believed the self communicates through vitality. What gives you quiet strength? What makes you feel more integrated after doing it? What conversations feel honest instead of strategic? These are signals. But to hear them, you must reduce noise, less comparison, less constant consumption, more reflection, more solitude, more intentional action. Solitude is not isolation. It is psychological differentiation. It is where you separate your voice from the crowd's echo. The generation that feels lost does not need louder motivation. It needs deeper roots. Roots grow downward, into darkness, into shadow, into history, into personal truth. And roots are invisible. That's why rebuilding feels slow. There is no external proof at first, no dramatic transformation, just small acts of integrity. Saying no when you mean no. Saying yes when you mean yes. Admitting when you're wrong. Admitting when you want more. Admitting when you're afraid. Each honest admission integrates another fragment. And slowly, the fragmentation decreases. You no longer feel split between who you are and who you show. That alignment creates gravity. People feel it, not because you are louder, but because you are coherent. Coherence is power, and power without shadow integration is dangerous. But power with integration is stabilizing. Jung warned about collective possession when individuals dissolve into movements, ideologies, group identities. Rebuilding requires resisting possession. You can have beliefs, strong ones, but they should not replace your individuality. If your identity collapses, when your belief is questioned, you are possessed. If you can question your own stance without psychological collapse, you are individuating. The lost generation often swings between extremes: total detachment, total immersion, but individuation is centered, engaged, but not consumed, committed, but not possessed. Rebuilding also requires responsibility, not blame. Responsibility. Jung was clear: until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. How much of what you call bad luck is actually unexamined pattern? How much of what you call toxic people is actually repeated unconscious attraction? How much of what you call burnout is actually misalignment? Responsibility is empowering because it returns agency, and agency is the antidote to feeling lost. You may not control the world, but you can confront yourself, and confronting yourself is the most radical act in a distracted age. The more integrated you become, the less reactive you are, less triggered, less desperate for validation, less afraid of rejection, because rejection no longer threatens your identity. Your identity is internally built, not externally negotiated. That is freedom, not the freedom to do anything, the freedom to be something, something whole, something grounded, something authentic. But understand this: individuation is not a one-time event. It is lifelong. You will outgrow identities again. You will confront deeper shadows again. You will shed skins repeatedly. But each cycle brings more stability, more clarity, more depth. The generation that feels lost is not doomed. It is being invited. Invited to move beyond imitation, beyond curated personas, beyond collective possession, into psychological adulthood. And adulthood is not age. It is integration. So here is the real warning Jung would give. If you avoid this work, you will live reactively. You will chase meaning instead of embodying it. You will blame systems instead of confronting self. You will grow older without growing deeper. But if you accept this work, you become rare, grounded in chaos, clear in confusion, whole in a fragmented world. And that wholeness becomes a stabilizing force for others, not because you try to lead, but because you are anchored. Now listen carefully. If any part of this resonated, if you felt exposed, challenged, seen, that is not coincidence. That is recognition. Don't scroll away from recognition. Sit with it. Reflect tonight. Journal what you've been avoiding. Name one shadow you've projected. Name one truth you've been suppressing. And then act. One small aligned action. Because insight without action becomes another performance. And this channel, this work, is not about performance. It is about individuation. If you're ready to stop feeling lost and start becoming whole, then stay on this path. Subscribe, not for motivation, for integration. Share this with someone who feels disconnected but doesn't have the language for it. And comment one word: integrate. Not for me, for yourself. A private commitment made public. Because the moment you choose wholeness, you are no longer part of a lost generation. You are part of the individuating few. And that changes everything.